Started.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Donahue, and I'm the Education Curator at the Wingate Museum of Art at Hendrix College. While we are hosting this program virtually, we want to acknowledge that the Wingate Museum of Art occupies the traditional homelands of the Osage, Quapaw, and Caddo. We offer respect and gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who have cared for the land over generations. We ask that you please keep your microphone muted to avoid distraction or disruption. If you have any questions during the program, please type them in the chat box and we will address them at the end. I'm pleased to introduce one of our panelists, Patterson Clark. Patterson earned a BA in biology from Hendrix in 1977. He then returned to the college the following year and earned an additional degree in studio art in 1978. He later earned an MFA in art and design from the California Institute of the Arts in 1982. After graduating, Clark held numerous journalistic positions, including working for the Arkansas Gazette and the Miami Herald as an op-ed illustrator and environmental graphics designer. He worked for the Washington Post as a science graphics editor and illustrator for 20 years and is now a senior graphics editor for Politico, where he produces data visualizations and informational graphics related to energy and environmental policy. Patterson has also been harvesting DC's exotic invasive vegetation for 15 years now, exploring its potential for use as art, food, fuel, and fiber. He converts these invasive plants into supplies, which he then uses to create art and music informed by their bounty. You can find Patterson at alienweeds.com. Our other panelist this evening is Dan Rizzi. Dan was born in Poughkeepsie, New York, but grew up in India, Egypt, Jordan, and Jamaica. He attended Hendrix for his undergraduate education, where he earned a studio art degree in 1973. He then went on to earn an MFA in painting from Southern Methodist University's Meadow Schools of the Arts in 1975. Shortly after leaving graduate school, Dan enjoyed a successful 13-year career as an artist in Dallas before moving to New York in the mid-80s. He now lives in Sag Harbor, New York, where he continues to create and exhibit new work. Dan's art has reached international acclaim and currently resides in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Dallas Museum of Art, amongst others. He has participated in numerous solo and group exhibitions, including shows at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, the Royal Academy of Art in London, and the Parrish Art Museum in Southampton. Among other awards, Dan received the Hendrix College Distinguished Alumni Award in 2005. In 2015, the University of Texas Press published Dan Rizzi, a monograph of the artist with interviews and essays on his work. And in 2018, he released Bird on a Blade, a project in collaboration with Roseanne Cash. You can find Dan's work at danrizzistudio.com. And last but not least, I'm pleased to introduce our host for this evening, Rebecca Jolly. Rebecca is a senior at Hendrix College, earning degrees in English and art history. She currently works for the Wingate Museum of Art as a museum associate in curatorial research. Rebecca, I will turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I want to echo Sarah's welcome and thank you all for attending our panel tonight. I'm really excited to chat with you both, Dan and Patterson, and then to bring in audience questions at the end. So like Sarah said, this event is part of a series of alumni panels held in conjunction with our Art at Hendrix exhibition, which both of our panelists were kind enough to lend work to. And the focus of that show is on the rich and diverse bodies of artwork that come out of Hendrix, and then how the college impacts the artists who attend it. So to that end, I'd love to kick off tonight's panel by asking you both to reflect a bit on your time at Hendrix. And this is a purposefully open-ended question, but I'd love to hear about any professors, courses, or just general memories from your time at Hendrix that really stick with you. So Dan, if it's okay, I'd love to start with you.
Okay, sure. Well, I mean, honestly, my time at Hendrix is where it all started. my life up to the time of my first year of college was, spread out over geographically. It went from living in the Middle East for 6 years and spending time in Jamaica for 3 or 4 years, ultimately ending up in, I lived actually very close to where Pat Clark lives now. I lived in Arlington, Virginia for quite a few years and attended high school and junior high school there, but I ended up finishing high school in New Delhi, India, where I went for 3 years. And from India, I came to Hendrix. And that's where it all began for me. I was really, I think, accepted at Hendrix College because I was a really good swimmer. They made mention of the art department, and they wanted students that were interested in art, at least from the documents in the magazine that I had that I first discovered Hendrix at. But I basically threw, while I was a senior in high school in New Delhi, India, I threw a dart at a map, and it hit Conway, Arkansas. Very weird, but that's truly the way it happened. And it was the beginning of everything that I'm about today. So meeting Don Marr and Bill Hawes, who were the teachers, and I think Pat probably had the same teachers, even though I was a couple years ahead of him. It was an extraordinary time. It was an extraordinary time in history. It was an extraordinary time for me. And that's where it all began for me.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. Patterson, can I throw it over to you?
You're breaking up a little bit, Rebecca, but I think I understand the question. I grew up on the Hendrix campus. My dad was a professor of botany there. So as a kid, the campus was my playground. I knew all the buildings, I knew all the teachers. And so it was just, there was no question that I would be going there for college. And also there was no question that I would major in biology because I was really interested in birds and insects, and those were the things that really captivated me. But I took some drawing classes with Bill Hawes, and that sort of planted a seed. I was good friends with his son and had been over to Bill's house and had seen the art he made, and that really opened up my mind a lot. I took some more art classes with Bill Hawes and also Don Marr, and it just sort of grabbed me. So one day I went to Bill Hawes's office and said, I'm going to change my major to art. And his advice was stick with the science degree. So then come back for art. So that's what I did. I finished up the biology degree and went back for a 5th year to study art. After that, I did a lot of different jobs. I worked in a factory, taught high school chemistry, was a carpenter for a while. Then I went to art school, and when I was in art school, I read this set of volumes by Arnold Hauser called The Social History of Art. And it explained how art operates within culture. And it's kind of a Marxist perspective. And after that, I sort of found myself pressing art into the service of journalism, and later on enlisting it as a service for my local environment. So that's kind of where I am today.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And my Wi-Fi is not great, so please feel free to stop me if I just completely cut out, and I'll try my best to get everything back working again. But I'd love to shift now to what you both did after you left Hendrix. And I know you've both already talked a little bit about this. but I know you both went to graduate school. And so I'd love to hear about that. And then Dan, maybe you could talk a little bit about your career in Dallas. And then Pat, maybe about, you already talked about this some, but working in journalism, starting with the Arkansas Gazette, and then the subsequent places that you've worked. So Dan, if that's okay, I'd love to have you answer first.
Yeah, sure. As my 4 years at Hendrix started to come to an end, I really started to worry because I knew that I wanted to be an artist, but I'll be honest with you, I remember telling my father before I even attended college that I wanted to be an artist. And he said, well, art's really a hobby. It's not a profession. So I always sort of had that stuck in my mind, but that's not the advice that I got from Don Marr or Bill Hawes. Towards my final year at Hendrix, and unlike Pat, I sort of completely focused on art. There was nothing else in my world at the time, and I didn't want anything else. I wanted to be an artist. I didn't really know what that meant, but Bill Hawes, the studio teacher there, told me to consider graduate school. Well, I remember calling my father, speaking to my father about that, and he's like, you really want to go through with this, you're on your own. So I sort of had that in mind. I knew I was on my own, but I applied for graduate school at SMU. I got accepted, and I left Conway, in my little Volkswagen with everything I owned in it. And, honestly, as corny as it sounds, just a couple $100, and drove up to the campus of SMU. I'd been accepted. And the first thing I was told was that they weren't able to give me the scholarship money that they thought they were able to give me, but they were going to give me enough money to take a couple classes. And I had a teaching assistantship or something. It's all Arabic to me at the time. But I managed to lie my way into a job at a local gallery in town, not a very good one either. And I basically worked my way up the ladder. I arrived in Dallas at a time when the museum was still down in Fair Park. It was still an Art Deco building that was down where they have the Texas State Fair every year. And they were just in the process of moving it up into the arts district. So I kind of rode a wave in Dallas. I arrived as an absolute unknown nobody, and kind of just kept sticking my foot in the door, which is, I think, you kind of need to do regardless of whatever star you're chasing. You need to be aggressive, and you need to be, especially in the art world or the literature world, or if you're going to be an actor or something like that. I really kind of enjoyed it because Dallas was experiencing the birth of the arts in Dallas, and they went from having this little podunk museum to this major museum that was a symphony hall included. All of a sudden there was an arts district, and just down the road was Fort Worth, Texas, and they had the Amon Carter, the Kimball, and the Fort Worth Museum of Modern Art. I mean, three of the greatest museums, not just in America, but in the world. As a matter of fact, Andy Warhol said his favorite museum in the world was the Kimball in Fort Worth, Texas, which sort of speaks for itself. That said, I did a number of different jobs. I drove a truck. It took me 2.5 years to get through graduate school. I had a pretty rough time at graduate school. I don't think I did that well, but my last year in graduate school, I sort of pulled myself together, and I think I produced a show, which was part of my thesis. We had to write a thesis, and we had to do a major show of your work, because I was a studio artist, and it I got lucky. I was reviewed by the Dallas Morning News critic Janet Kuttner. She gave me a very good review, and my work sold very well. Now I was selling, drawings for $150, but in 74, that wasn't really too bad. And I eventually got picked up by a gallery and started, climbing the ladder that I've climbed my entire life, making prints, having shows in different places, not just in America, but around the world. And here we are.
Thank you. Can I toss it over to you now to talk about your experience after Hendrix?
I did make a sojourn to Dallas to see Dan. And he got me a job as a slacker at Delahunty Gallery.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, and I lasted about, I don't know, 2 weeks.
That's right. I forgot
ran
about that.
back to Arkansas. Ran back to Arkansas. Got a job in a factory. Then I think I went to Maine and painted houses and just did a lot of stuff before graduate school. Went out to Cal Arts just north of Los Angeles for a couple of years. And it was kind of there were a lot of Marxists teaching there, a lot of social criticism and classes that would last from 10 a.m. until 2 a.m. But there was a guy out there named Michael Asher who would just lead us through these grueling analytical sessions. So Cal Arts was kind of an upending for me. After that, I moved back to Arkansas again and sort of fell into journalism. I started working as an artist at the Arkansas Gazette, began doing op-ed illustrations, editorial illustrations. Then I moved to the Miami Herald and did that for the Herald for about 6 or 7 years. But I also kept a sort of an environmental journalism going on. At the Arkansas Gazette, I worked on pieces which sort of explained forest management to the general reader. And I did this in a visual way. At the Miami Herald, I work on visual pieces about the Everglades, trying to explain the kind of complex system, the water system down there. I was in Miami when it got hit by Hurricane Andrew, which just leveled part of the city. Spent a couple of months climbing around wrecked houses with a structural engineer so I could explain how some of these houses came apart. So I used visual diagrams and photographs put together to explain what went wrong with the houses in Miami. It was interesting. There were some subdivisions that were completely intact, yet right next door would be subdivisions that were totally demolished. So it came down to these kind of structural nuances that I tried to explain visually. The Post, Washington Post saw that work and asked me to come up to DC. And I spent about 20 years at the Washington Post doing science graphics, some op-ed pieces. I was a columnist for a few years, looking at the sort of natural history that people might notice on their way out the door on the way to work in the nation's capital. The little things, little arcane insects and flower parts, weather patterns, whatever I saw on my walk, I would focus on. And some of these things I'd see on my walk were invasive plants, uh, which are really common in urban areas. Um, so to spend more time outdoors, I applied to be a volunteer with the National Park Service. And that's when the weeds discovered me.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I'd love to shift now to more about your art specifically. So I would love to hear about some of your artistic influences, and then also how you came into the mediums with which you work in, and the general styles that you work in at the moment. So again, that's kind of broad, but it's intentionally so. So Dan, if it's okay, we'll start with you.
Yeah. You want to focus on an influence, right?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So, I mean, I think as a kid, my parents were pretty hip. They were sort of modern furniture people, you know. My father and mother, I remember them being very, I wouldn't use the word stylish, but you know, I like the way my father dressed, and you know, they both smoked cigarettes and drank cocktails, and had really cool friends, and a lot of their friends were musicians and artists. Specifically, when we lived in the Middle East, I remember this one Italian artist that had a art school, and of all places in downtown Amman, Jordan, and he was a friend of my parents, and he was a kind of a crazy man. He used to chase me around the house with a violin, playing a violin, making it sound like um, um, uh, a cop car, like. And I just thought it was fantastic that these grown-ups acted as childish as I did. Probably had a big influence on me becoming an artist. Like, uh, uh, that said, you know, I do remember going down to class. I never liked the class part of it. You know, I remember his name was Armando, and I remember him setting up this still life that had a human skull in it and some flowers and stuff. And the minute he left the room, I just started crying. I thought, I can't do this. This is as bad as you know, trying to learn arithmetic. And then I was, you know, diagnosed later on in life as having serious attention deficit disorder, which I still suffer from, but I've learned how to control it and live with it. At the time, I didn't really know how to deal with it. I'm actually doing it right now. I'm spreading myself way too thin and explaining in answering your question. But the first influence I really remember was Bill Hawes, really moving from the swimming team at Hendrix over to the art department and thinking, this is where my home is here. And fortunately, that happened in my freshman year. And I just thought Bill Hawes's work was just incredible. And I'm going to probably answer a bit of a question you're going to ask later. Don Marr, his art history classes sort of sealed the deal for me, you know, because he dealt with contemporary art history and art history that, you know, took you to the Uffizi and through classic works, the whole gamut. But Bill Hawes sort of was to me like a pop artist. I'd be interested to hear what Pat has to say about his work, but I'd never quite seen anything like it, and it really was exciting to me. And basically, I did what I think a lot of artists did. I just sort of imitated him. I'm not going to say I copied him, but I asked him, like, how do you get, you know, how do you use acrylic paint to make it look like the way you make it look? And I mean, that's a lot about making art, you know. How do you put it down? I was looking at Pat Clark's website today, and he's got all this stuff, these brushes made out of um, um, weeds and things that he's dug up out of the garden. I mean, I've figured out how to get a particular type of stick that gives me a line. If I scrape it down the canvas and, you know, into wet paint, I can achieve a mark, if you will, that you know, is really what I wanted in my head. You know, if you're an illustrator, and Pat can draw beautifully, I love to draw. You learn these little tricks, these little things that you can do that maybe work for you and eventually become part of your trademark. For instance, I would bring up somebody like Philip Guston, like that. I mean, the guy knew how to draw with paint, and so my it's a simplified answer to your question, but my first influences were right there at Hendrix. You know, I started looking at art history, started going to the library, and, you know, digging through Art Forum and Art in America and art history books. But I was interested in contemporary art, and I felt that Bill Hawes was a really great contemporary artist, maybe from the school of Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. And I learned about it through them. So my first real influence, an artist that I was really influenced by, other than, you know, the run of the mill people that I've just mentioned, Bill Hawes was my first real influence. My teacher, and how convenient was that?
That's great, and thank you for that answer. Pat, if I could move on to you, if you want to talk about artistic influences, but also, you know, how you came to start harvesting these invasive work from them.
Well, Dan Rizzi has always been a big inspiration to me.
Oh, stop it.
I've always admired and looked up to Dan. And I learned about Dan through Bill Hawes, who was probably the biggest influence on me. Bill just taught me that anything goes. Bill believed that everything was art. He had a debate once with a mathematician. The mathematician said everything is math, and Bill argued that everything was art. So I took him seriously, that whatever I did could be art. Now, this was in the early 70s, when there was a lot of experimentation going on. Conceptual art was being developed, and happenings or performance art was sort of the scene at the time. And then Bill had this art that was, I agree with Dan, it was pop, and had some pop elements to it, but it had this Zen quality too, this sort of stillness. He made this series, and I think you can see him over in the library, a series of air boxes, these elaborate monuments to hold a certain volume of air. I just thought that was incredible. Very inspirational. So yeah, and then I think I jumped the gun earlier. Arnold Hauser's books were a big influence on me, and sort of the CalArts scene of sort of recognize how your art operates within the culture. That had a big influence on me. Might have talked about some of this earlier, but yeah. And then there of course, a whole newsroom full of journalists who've had influences on me. Really great designers, investigative reporters, writers, musicians, environmentalists, park rangers, factory workers, my wife, a lot of influences there in the mix. And of course, my dad, who was a botanist, gave me the keys to sort of understand the environment, the natural environment that I was in. And those keys have helped me unlock some things that have continued to interest me.
Great. Thank you for that. I want to, for the next portion of the panel, I want to ask you guys questions that are specifically tailored to both of you. So different questions for the two of you. And then we'll come back together for the last question, and then we'll see if the audience has anything to ask. But Dan, you were absolutely correct a second ago when you said you figured I was going to ask you art history later on the panel. But you have a Jane Livingston quote on your website, and in that she says that your knowledge of art history informs your art deeply, but in offbeat, even eccentric ways. So I'd love to hear about the influence that art history has on your work, and then maybe about how it manifests in those eccentric ways.
Can you hear me?
I can. Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, something's happened to my screen here. I'm trying to figure out how to get back to where we were. Your microphone is unmuted. Your video is stopped. Oh, gee.
Do you want me to come back to you, or do you want to answer with your camera off? Oh, there you are.
I'm completely there's something else on my screen now. I don't know what happened.
You're back.
Can you hear me?
See you.
We can hear you and see you.
I really don't know what happened.
Lost you, Dan.
Your video has stopped.
We can see you now.
I don't know what to do here.
We can see you right now.
I can barely hear you, and I can't see anything. I'm not sure. Oh, I'm in a safe driving mode. That's good to know. Gee, I'm sorry, guys. It's. Geez.
That's a big car.
Oh, here we are. Am I back?
We can hear you well. Your camera is not on.
I can't hear you is the problem. Can you keep talking?
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me any better now?
No, it's you're barely audible.
Sarah, do you have any ideas about what to do?
I don't. I've been looking at the various buttons that I have.
Why don't you ask Pat, and I'll try and get.
Great. Well, Pat, I'll throw you a question now. I'd love to hear about how and when you started turning invasive plant species into arts materials. So how you began doing that, and for how long you've been doing that.
I think it was in 2003. I had been pulling weeds in the national park for several years. And one day I bent over to pull up this young bush sapling, and I sort of realized that I had developed a really antagonistic relationship toward this weed, or towards all these weeds, and kind of felt a hostility when I was out in the woods, and really didn't want to feel that way when I was outside. So I thought, well, how can I change my relationship with this plant? I still need to pull it, but what can I do to alter my interface with it? So I wanted to honor the plant, to honor the material that it was giving me. And there was so much of it out there, I realized, well, maybe instead of eradication, I'll engage in harvest. So I didn't think I was going to be making art out of it. I just thought, well, I'm going to harvest all this material, which is presenting itself, and I'm going to honor it by making something useful out of it. What can I do? So I started tearing these plants apart, experimenting with them, reading about them. I found that some of these plants that are invasive species are really fantastic paper making, produce paper making fibers. So I started learning the paper making process, and um, uh, a byproduct of the paper making process is this stuff called black liquor, which sometimes is a beautiful pigment. So I started learning how to chemically engineer this pigment to make inks that I could put on the paper. And so before I knew it, I was making art again. Um, uh, and I kept experimenting with these different plants. There's so many invasive species in the District of Columbia. They're invasive trees that I've uh, had taken to sawmills and cutting the lumber. So I had to learn woodworking skills. I started making printing blocks out of the wood. So I had to learn how to use letterpress skills and press making skills. Um, I started making musical instruments out of the wood, the weed wood, and now I've spent the last couple of years learning how to play an end-blown flute. I made a marimba out of invasive white mulberry. So now I'm having to learn music so that I can provide an accompaniment for a little animated film that I'm working on, which is made from invasive species. So one thing sort of leads to another, and it presents all sorts of new challenges for me. Uh, there's no end in sight, except my end.
Gotcha. Well, you talked a little bit about this, so that's great. We were actually curious if to see if you talk a little bit more about your process. So maybe picking making paper or ink or something that you've done from in invasive species, and then generally talk to us a little bit about the process of transforming it into something else.
Well, it kind of depends on the species. I mentioned white mulberry earlier. In the, I'm hearing an echo. Now I don't. Okay. In January, I harvest white mulberry stems about as big around as my thumb. I'll cut these into lengths, put them in a steamer, steam them for about half an hour, strip the bark off, scrape the outer bark off to reveal an inner flexible inner bark. I cook that in ash that I've gathered from burning white mulberry wood. That breaks the fibers down. I wash those, use that in the paper making process to form sheets of paper. With the same wood from white mulberry, I'll take chips and burn them under a big sort of stainless steel plate to collect the soot. Then I'll take that soot, scrape it off onto a ground glass plate, and use an ink muller to mix in a little gum arabic, a little glycerin to make an ink for a wood block also made out of white mulberry. So I spread the ink onto the white mulberry block, print that on the white mulberry paper, and usually it's an image of white mulberry. So that's sort of a one species picture. And I'm dealing with maybe 50 different invasive species. One beautiful species is called leatherleaf mahonia. It's a common landscaping plant. The fruits on it are purple in June, and they're really good to eat. They have a lot of vitamin C in them. They've got a bunch of seeds in them. Birds eat them, spread them out into the woodlands. They grow like crazy. But if you cut the stems of them, take a knife to them, there's this fluorescent yellow that is exposed. I put that in ethanol to extract the yellow, evaporate it, and I've got this beautiful glow in the dark yellow ink. It's also a medicine that's a great antibacterial. So I use it for infections. Hadn't drunk it yet.
Sorry, my computer is so I can't at the moment.
Dan, it looks like you're back.
Yeah. But I think it froze up for a minute there, Pat.
Oh.
I'm actually laying down on my couch because it's the only place in my house where I have decent Wi-Fi.
Whatever works. That's totally fine.
We have a real problem with stuff like that out here. I live in a really small little town out in the eastern end of Long Island, and it's anyway. I think you froze, Rebecca.
Oh, okay.
You're frozen right now.
Am I less frozen now?
Yeah. I want to introduce you to my dog. Come here, Trixie.
What's that around his neck?
Oh, she had ACL surgery.
Oh. It's the.
Oh,
It looks like
and
a cone.
I'll give you a small tour of the house right now. The refrigerator the door was open and it beeps, and she's an Australian Shepherd, so she's much smarter than I am. That said, are we back in business here?
Yeah, if you're good to be back in business. I'm assuming that for me to repeat the question that I asked before, the technical difficulties. So Dan, on your website, you have a Jane Livingston quote, and in that she says that your knowledge of art history informs your art deeply, but often in offbeat, even eccentric ways. So I'd love to hear about this influence that art history has on your work, and then also maybe a little bit about how it does manifest in eccentric ways.
Well, I know that quote that Jane Livingston made, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for her, with the exception of the fact that she, takes me seriously. But I, how do I say this? I'm, like Pat and Bill Hawes's son Clem were really good friends. They were both really cool artists and musicians, did all the crazy stuff that I did, but they were also really good students, and I consider them to be, very smart and able to navigate a school like Hendrix over the 4 years, which was really kind of tough for me. But I got to tell you, the class, my first art history class with Don Marr really opened up the water gates for me. I never liked studying. I never liked reading unless it was something that I wanted to read. So consequently, being given homework and stuff like that was really difficult for me. But I really enjoyed Don Marr's art history classes, and started to learn something. It's a pretty basic equation to me that if you're gonna study medicine, you should read about the history of medicine. If you're gonna study literature, you should read about the history of literature. acting, whatever. And I, as a result of taking some of Don's classes, and I think maybe when Pat was there, I don't know if Don did this, but I think he started taking students to like Florence and going to the Uffizi and some of the major galleries in the world. I would have loved to done that while I was there, but it contemporary art history was very interesting to me, and that's how I learned to be, a contemporary artist. I studied the history, because without it, the what's happening at the moment doesn't exist. There is no art without art history. There is no medicine without medicine history. It's all there. And I think Pat came from a very, very his father being a botanist and I believe he was a doctor and taught at Hendrix. And Pat talking about being a kid there. I that's a great environment to be in, and I think it probably ended up in what he's doing today in one way or another. I didn't come from my father. My father loved art, but the real big influence and the beginning of it all was my years at Hendrix. I mean, it was a very albeit somewhat boring in the explanation of it, but that's it kind of it really worked for me. The whole program seemed to fit nicely with me, and to be honest with you, still does. I still consider it how I got started and why I'm doing what I'm doing today. I know that's kind of a crazed answer, but
No, that's a great answer. And we're running up on time a little bit, so I'm going to ask you one more question, Dan, and then I think we're going to open it up to the audience. So my last question for the night is, as we've already mentioned a bit throughout the panel, you grew up both inside and outside the United States. So you lived in places like Jordan and Egypt. So could you talk a little bit about how those locations and then maybe the imagery and iconography have influenced your work?
Well, yeah, and that's a really that's kind of a great question. Living in India informed me artistically, spiritually, emotionally, religiously, in so many ways, because as a young kid who was I guess I was 16 when I first moved there, and I was 18 when I left and headed for Hendrix. I really didn't want to go to India. I was living just outside of Washington, D.C. in Arlington, very close to where Pat lives now. And I was I went to Stratford Junior High School, which was the first junior high school in Northern Virginia that had busing for Black and white students at the same time. Then I went to a partial year at Washington Lee High School in Arlington, Virginia, and art was it was a little bit on the scene there, but going to India was. I was trying to think today, because you were kind enough to send some questions in advance. What was the influence? I mean, living in India at the time, even though I can say this now, I couldn't have said it then, but it was almost like living in an abstract expressionist painting. There was graffiti and chaos, but a kind of a beauty that came out of all that chaos. Not dissimilar to what Pat was talking about, like this crazy array of weeds, and how do you make sense out of it? Walking from my house to the bus stop in India, you'd see years worth of stuff that you wouldn't see in America, and by that I mean, they chewed beetle juice over there, beetle nut and would spit it on the street. So there'd be these whitewashed walls with these, slashes of color going up and down them. They were very much like, de Kooning paintings and Franz Klein's paintings, graffiti like you've never seen before, way before you ever saw it in New York. So the influence sometimes it just seeps into you whether you want it to or not. But I realized about 20 years ago, and more so realized it about 5 or 6 years ago when I went back to India, just as with a friend of mine who I went to high school with there, who lives in Washington and works for a conservation international company, or he just retired. But we went back together and visited our own old haunts, and I realized what an influence this place had on me, specifically a visit that I made to Agra to see the Taj Mahal when I was about 15 or 16 years old. And all those flowers and that sort of decorative Islamic calligraphy, if you will, came directly out of that. I remember bringing a couple catalogs with me from recent shows and showing them to the driver, and he was going, "Oh yeah, these were made from you must have painted these at the Taj Mahal." And truth of the matter was, I didn't paint those paintings until 25, 30 years after I left India. So I would say, I'll still hold on to the Hendrix years, but living overseas certainly informed what I'm doing today, and probably what I'll continue to do for the rest of my life.
Great. Well, thank you both for answering all of my questions with such attentiveness and care. I am now going to open it up to the audience if anyone wants to ask a question to Dan or Pat or both. You can unmute yourself and just ask it, or you can drop it in the chat and we'll read it out.